3, 2, 1.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to Energizing the Future with Blockchain. Our webinar today is with K&L Gates in partnership with InfoCast Events. Today I have with me Molly Suda and Ben Tablum from K&L Gates. Before we get started, if you have any questions, please type your questions in the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We will answer questions if time permits. Thank you so much. And now I'd like to welcome Molly Suda and Ben Tablum. Ben.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to InfoCast for hosting this webinar today. Also, thank you to everyone listening in and taking the time to join us today for this webinar on blockchain and the energy industry. I am Molly Suda, as Catherine mentioned. I'm a partner in the energy group in Washington, D.C. at K&L Gates, and Ben Tablum is with me. He's an associate here as well. So we'll start out now just with a quick overview of what we're planning to cover in today's webinar. So Ben will kick off with an explanation of what blockchain technology is, describing its core features and how it's different from how it's different from Bitcoin. Then after we've covered some of the blockchain basics, I'll give you an overview of smart contracts and how they work in conjunction with blockchain technology. I'll also touch on some legal issues around their enforceability. And then we'll pause at that point to see if there's any questions about the basics of blockchain and smart contracts that we've covered up until that point. And then we'll wrap up the presentation by me running through several examples of how blockchain technology is being applied in the energy industry. Next slide. So I'll kick it over to Ben for his overview of blockchain basics.
Thanks, Molly. So before we dive in talking about how blockchain works, I have just a few opening points that I think are helpful when thinking about blockchain technology. The first is to remember that blockchain is a software technology, so there's no universal blockchain application or single blockchain software. All of the technology underlying blockchain generally relies on three core components, which I'm going to discuss shortly. But not all blockchain programs are created the same. The technology can be tailored to meet specific needs and achieve specific functions depending on the needs of your specific business application. So second, and this one is important, blockchain is not the same thing as Bitcoin. We still get this a lot, and it's important to clarify. Bitcoin, the digital currency, is created, bought, and sold using a blockchain network. And the Bitcoin blockchain was the first large-scale implementation of blockchain technology. But at this point, Bitcoin and virtual currencies in general are really just one example of how blockchain technology can be used. So an analogy I like to use for this is if you think about vehicle technology, you can think about blockchain like the automobile engine. Bitcoin is like the Model T. So it may be the first of its kind. It's not without flaws, but it was still groundbreaking technology, and the same could sort of be true for blockchain. So third, blockchain technology is not limited to applications involving monetary transactions or even transactions in general. So at its core, blockchain is just a means of storing and manipulating information, and it can be used in connection with any electronic data set. So as you see on the screen, I talk about this concept tokenization, and what we mean by that is so long as anything can be given a digital unique identifier, which in this day and age is almost anything, it can be stored and manipulated in a blockchain-powered network. Next slide, please. So what is blockchain technology? We've included a comprehensive definition here on the slide, but really at its core, what blockchain technology allows is for connected computers in a peer-to-peer, decentralized, or distributed network to reach agreement over shared data. And what this means is that the data in the ledger can be updated and verified and manipulated in real time without the need for a central trusted moderator. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? If you think about transferring money over the internet, right now you'd use PayPal, Venmo, or even your bank. And the reason you use them is because they are a trusted central party. You may not trust the person you're sending money to, but you trust the central party, be it your bank or PayPal, to verify the specifics of the transaction, to ensure you have the money you say you do, to ensure that the counterparty has a bank account, all of those elements. So what blockchain does is it eliminates the need for that central party. Instead, the ledger, which contains all of the information, resides with all of the market participants, and the network itself works to verify the transactions. So what this does is it allows for a trustless but secure architecture where information can be manipulated between parties without a central governing party in real time. Next slide, please. So how does it work? We're going to provide a mile-high overview of the basic functions and the characteristics of a blockchain network. Just a few things to note before we do. This is intended to be a conceptual overview. We're not going to go into any detail about the underlying code, which is quite complex. The functions themselves are not overly complicated, but you can go into a lot of detail about the underlying cryptography, which we're not going to do today. And our goal here, or my goal, is that by the time I'm done, you'll have an understanding of what this slide means. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, there are three core components to any blockchain network, and all blockchain networks make use of these components. They are a peer-to-peer or distributed network, a consensus mechanism, and a shared ledger. So I'm now going to walk you through each of these components and talk about how they work. One central theme that I'd like you to keep in mind is that there is no one-size-fits-all blockchain. Each of these components can be tailored to meet different applications depending on your needs. Next slide, please. So the first component of all blockchain networks is the network itself. All blockchain technology applications make use of some form of peer-to-peer network, where each party to the network represents a single node. And so when we say peer-to-peer, we mean that there is no one central node that controls the information flowing among the parties. So if you look at the slide, on the left you'll see a traditional centralized network. In a centralized network, all the communications pass through one central governing node. So again, going back to the bank example, any transaction that you make through your bank or through PayPal, those transactions always go through that central bank or PayPal node. Everything has to pass through the bank or PayPal server. Conversely, if you look all the way to the right, in a distributed network, you can see that there's no central governing node. Instead, all of the nodes communicate freely with one another without the need for one governing intermediary. Next slide, please. So one important takeaway about peer-to-peer networks is that they are not by default open to the public or accessible by anyone. When we talk to people about blockchain, they often envision peer-to-peer or blockchain meaning that anyone can have access to the information uploaded to the blockchain network. But this is actually not the case. So a blockchain network can be designed to be either open or closed, and the software designer deciding the parameters to the network can decide what the parameters are to govern access to the network. So this means that a network can be peer-to-peer and be open to everyone, or it can be peer-to-peer and only be accessible to a select group of peers. So if you look at the examples here on the slide, if an energy trading exchange wanted to use blockchain to record transactions among exchange participants, they'd likely set up a closed blockchain. And what that would look like is that access to the blockchain, although within the network it would be peer-to-peer among exchange participants, there would be essentially a digital fence around the network. And access would only be granted to pre-approved exchange participants. So on the flip side, if you wanted to create a blockchain network to facilitate, say, peer-to-peer electric vehicle charging, and you want that to be accessible to all consumers worldwide, that would be an open blockchain network, where anyone would be able to download the app and gain access. Next slide, please. So the second component of all blockchain networks is the consensus mechanism. All blockchain networks employ some form of consensus, which is the code that they use to determine how the network itself agrees on what information or transactions are valid. So again, going back to the traditional centralized database, if you think about your bank, consensus is established by the trusted party. So in that case, the bank is the party that looks at a transaction and determines whether it's valid. The bank is the only party that does that. If you want to transfer money, the bank looks at your account and determines whether you have the money you say you do. So in a decentralized distributed blockchain network, the blockchain consensus mechanism is required because there is no central party to verify the accuracy of transactions or information posted to the network. Instead, all of the nodes on a blockchain network use a program consensus protocol to determine and agree that information posted to the blockchain is either valid or invalid. So there are a couple different forms of consensus, and there are a few different ways to establish consensus. The two most popular right now are proof of work and proof of stake. The code underlying these consensus mechanisms is very complex, so we're not going to go into any further detail, but just know that there are a variety of ways to establish consensus, each with its own pros and cons, some of which may be more applicable to one form of blockchain over another. And again, the level of consensus you need depends in large part on whether or not it's a public or private blockchain. If it's a private blockchain where the identity of all the parties are known, you're less concerned about rigorous consensus because there's some degree of trust between the parties already. If it's a totally open and public network, then you're going to want a more rigorous form of consensus because there is no trust between parties. Next slide, please. So the third component of all blockchain networks is the shared ledger. All blockchain technology makes use of some form of a distributed immutable ledger. Like the network itself, the ability to access the ledger can be made public or private, and this is often called permissioned or permissionless, again, depending on the needs of the network. The ledger can also be designed as a hybrid, where some parties to the network are granted the access to actually write transactions or alter the ledger, while others are given read-only access, such that they're only able to read the history of transactions on the ledger, but are not able to initiate new transactions. So there's an example here on the slide. If you wanted to create a blockchain network developed to track all liquefied natural gas shipments to final destination, you'd want that ledger to contain a record of all the transactions undertaken by the shippers. So in order to accomplish this, you'd need the shippers to have the ability to actually write their transaction information to the ledger. But now say that you also want to have the Department of Energy to be able to see what happens on the network for regulatory reporting purposes. You want the regulator to be able to see the record of all the LNG shipments, but you don't want the regulator to be able to initiate transactions or otherwise upload additional information to the ledger. So this would be done by creating a blockchain network to which the regulator has only read-only access. So they'd only be able to view what goes on, and the actual LNG shippers would have the ability to actually update the ledger. Next slide, please. So I know we've just covered a lot of information, but I'm now just going to put it all together. This is a high-level diagram of how a blockchain network functions. So here in the slide, I have it set up to assume that this is a blockchain network designed to facilitate the trading of solar renewable energy credits. So if you look at the slide, if you assume that Bob wants to transfer ownership of a REC to Alice, what Bob would do is they would post that transaction to the network, and that would be posted as part of a single block. And a block can include all the transactions posted to the network within a given period of time. And again, that's totally customizable based on how you want to set up the network. A block could be all transactions within a minute. It could be all transactions within 10 minutes. That's entirely up to the software designer. So once the transaction is represented as part of this block, that block is then broadcast to all of the parties or nodes to the network. Using the consensus mechanism, the nodes work to verify that the transaction is valid, And again, what they're looking for there is to verify that Bob owns the rec that he wants to transfer to Alice, that Alice has paid him, and that Alice has an account and can receive this rec. So once the transaction is verified, the block is added to the chain of all of the blocks already existing on the shared ledger, and it's chained together using complex cryptography to make it immutable, so it cannot be altered. So there you have, that's hence blockchain, because you have the blocks that then get chained together. Once the block is added to the chain, it becomes part of the immutable ledger and the record of all transactions, and it cannot be altered. And so then ownership would then be transferred from Bob to Alice, and that's reflected in the network. Next slide, please. So just really quickly, again, this is just to highlight that there are many different ways to develop a blockchain. And the point here is that all of this is customizable and can be tailored to meet specific goals and needs of your network. So if you look at the slide, if you only need one copy of a ledger and you don't need to share it with anyone, you may not need a blockchain. If you do create a blockchain, but you want to have it so only a select few people can modify it, a permissioned or closed blockchain would probably be okay. But then again, if you want to have a blockchain where anybody can access the blockchain and anyone can become a party, like Bitcoin, then you need a public blockchain. Next slide, please. So just along the same lines, and this is going back to the Bitcoin blockchain for a minute, the purpose here is to demonstrate the difference between how a cryptocurrency blockchain is set up and one that would be used by a business or an exchange to interact in a more closed environment. So if you look at the slide, for cryptocurrencies, the parties to the action, the parties to the network are anonymous. This is why pirates and criminals love Bitcoin, right? Because they can transact on the network and nobody knows who they are. But the details to the action, i.e., what's going on in the network, is transparent. So anyone can go on the on the Bitcoin network and see the record going back to the beginning of what Bitcoins have been transferred where. Again, you don't know the identity of the parties to the transactions, but you can see all of the transactions. So now if you flip it on what would be a business blockchain, the parties to the action, the parties to the network would be transparent. You create a network among businesses. You're all relatively aligned in interest, so there's no need for anonymity. But the details to the action, the actual transactions, those can be designated as anonymous. So what that means is you can create a blockchain with a known group of businesses, but where the specifics of the transactions between the businesses are only viewable to the parties that need to see it. So if you had a network of all the electricity companies and you had a transaction between only two of them, that transaction could be anonymous to everybody but the transacting parties. Next slide, please. So just to wrap this all up, why is it all significant? So first, all of this can be done over a network in real time without the need for a third party, such as a bank or an exchange, working to verify the transactions. This process through a blockchain is essentially automated and handled by the network itself. So this has the potential to significantly reduce processing times and transaction costs. And second, because there's one shared ledger that's shared by everybody, it creates one immutable golden record of all the information shared on the network. This removes the need for every individual party to keep its own records of its transactions, since everybody has access to the same record book. Next slide, please. So this, just really quickly, are a couple considerations to think about if you're considering whether you need a blockchain network. The only one I'm going to touch on here is just to think about whether there are multiple parties in your ecosystem. If you're creating a network that's just internal within one company, you probably don't need a blockchain. If you want to create a network among several companies and you need all of them to have access to information in real time, then a blockchain may be right for your business application. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Molly, who's going to discuss how smart contracts tie in with blockchain, and then she's going to cover some of the emerging applications of blockchain technology that we're seeing in the energy space. So following her discussion of smart contracts, we'll break to see if you have any questions, and then we'll move on from there.
Thanks, Ben. Next slide, please. So smart contracts are particularly relevant in the context of blockchain energy applications as a means to reduce transaction costs, because they essentially allow for the automation of transactions without the need for a central coordinator. At a high level, a smart contract is just computer code that is programmed into the blockchain program and sits alongside the other information stored in the shared ledger. This code allows for the automatic execution of transactions over the blockchain network based on predefined conditions. On the slide, we give the example of a predefined condition being a particular price. So that smart contract could be coded to automatically take Y action if the price is X. There's also a wide spectrum of how people think about smart contracts being developed and used. On one end of the spectrum, there are the same natural language legal contracts that we have today with all the same terms and provisions in natural language, but then some of the terms of that agreement would be translated into computer code, and I'll give you an example of this in the next couple of slides. So the other end of the spectrum would be for the entire agreement to be represented in code with no separate natural language contract. In other words, the entire contract is the smart contract code that's sitting within the blockchain network. Next slide, please. So let's take a look at smart contracts and how they relate to blockchain technology in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned, the smart contract code essentially sits alongside the data that's stored in the distributed ledger. The smart contract would have coded predefined triggering conditions, and these conditions can be triggered by events within the blockchain network. So for example, a member node of the blockchain network sending a message to initiate a transaction. The triggering conditions of a smart contract could also be an external event that the blockchain network is sort of coded to look out for. And this is where the term oracles comes into play. Oracles are used to have a smart contract interact with external or so-called off-chain events. And oracles are essentially data feeds that provide external data when needed and push it onto the blockchain. So for example, if you had a blockchain network tracking ownership of a commodity and sales and transactions of a commodity, you could have a piece of code on the blockchain network that says if the price of the commodity is X, as reported by a particular commodity index, then transfer Y amount of the commodity from Ben's account on the shared ledger to Molly's account on the shared ledger for Z price. An oracle could pull in the information from that particular commodity index and trigger the smart contract condition. Oracles and smart contract conditions could also involve pulling in any type of data. So for example, temperature, information that a successful payment occurred, an order issued by a regulatory agency or court, or price fluctuations. It's really somewhat limitless. Next slide, please. So let's walk through an example of how a smart contract code could work in the energy sphere. In this example, we have a power purchase agreement, and one of the terms includes an option to buy power at a certain strike price. The option is a term in the natural language contract and reads, upon exercise of the option by option buyer, option seller will deliver the megawatt quantity and option buyer will pay the strike price. If the parties were part of the same blockchain network that manages transactions and handles billing and settlements, that option code could be encoded as a smart contract. And the code would define the relevant terms. So strike price, who the option buyer is, who the option seller is, and the megawatt quantity involved. There would also be a function code that defines the triggering conditions. So for this example, it could be the two triggering conditions. First, when the option buyer sends a message to show its intent to exercise the option. And second, when a smart meter records the data to confirm that the megawatts were delivered. If those two conditions are met, then the smart contract would automatically execute, sending 4,000 from the option buyer's account to the option seller's account. Next slide, please. So one of the challenges for smart contracts is how to represent more subjective contract terms into code. So for example, take a force majeure clause that excuses performance for events that were not anticipated or not within the reasonable control of the claiming party. Defining the conditions for the force majeure clause is difficult because there are subjective concepts like reasonableness or good faith that don't easily translate into code. And the difficulty in translating these conditions, like a force majeure clause, into code are part of the reason why smart contracts are often discussed as existing within this wide spectrum I talked about with varying levels of code and natural language contracts. Next slide, please. So when you mention smart contracts, one of the first questions that comes up is, are they enforceable? Are they legal contracts? And as we've discussed, there's a wide spectrum of the form and function of what a smart contract could be. So the first step in thinking about enforceability is to understand the nature of what the smart contract is and what it's doing. Is it just a term from a natural language contract that's been translated into code and is just simply executing the terms of the natural language contract, or is it an entirely separate coded agreement? Regardless of the form that the smart contract takes, normal contracting principles are expected to apply to determine the smart contract's enforceability. So for example, you'd ask questions about, is there evidence of offer, acceptance, and intent to be bound, and consideration? And replicating natural language into code should not necessarily remove the enforceability of that underlying natural language contract, because that natural language contract would still exist to demonstrate that the features of a legally enforceable agreement are met. To evaluate enforceability, we could also look to the body of law that's developed around e-commerce. So for example, shrink wrap and click-through agreements have been accepted by courts as legally enforceable agreements. There's also existing body of statutes and case law around electronic signatures that can be applied. So similar to how states adopted electronic signature laws and other laws to accommodate e-commerce, states are also beginning to address enforceability of smart contracts. And just this past April, Arizona passed a law clarifying that a contract may not be denied legal effect solely because it contains a smart contract term. Other states have developed similar legislation, and we expect other states may follow suit. Some of the more interesting and challenging questions arise around how disputes over a smart contract could be handled. Some argue that blockchain and smart contracts will actually mitigate and eliminate a lot of common contractual disputes that exist today, but there are a lot of open questions around dispute resolution. So for example, who would be the ultimate arbiter of disputes? A court, some other third party, or how the code or the sort of permissions and governance of the blockchain itself. And also, if remedying the dispute requires changes or corrections to the distributed ledger, who would have the authority or ability to change the otherwise immutable ledger? These are questions we don't have precise answers to today, and they'll likely evolve over time as more applications are developed, implemented, and scaled. Next slide, please. So before we dive into the energy industry applications, we wanted to pause here because we've thrown a lot of information at you about blockchain and smart contracts. And so if anybody had questions about just the basics that we've covered here, we can try to address those now. And I think you can type it into the chat feature if you have questions, and then Catherine can read those out.
We have a question from Tariq. What is the difference between decentralized and distributed networks?
So I don't know whether we can go back to that slide, but if you take a look at the picture, you can see that this decentralized still has aspects of centralization. Some nodes are not directly connected to all nodes versus the distributed. You create this more mesh network effect where even kind of the radial ends can be connected to other nodes. That's where a lot of the resiliency comes in with this distributed network, and that you can kind of there's a potential that you can't take down one or two nodes to disrupt the whole network, whereas in a decentralized model, you could take down one or two nodes and really cause harm from those radial points.
Yeah, I mean, just echoing that, I think one way to think about it is you can think of centralized, one control point. Decentralized, maybe you have 10 control points governing 100 nodes, and then distributed is the 100 nodes all have access to the ledger. So in that way, there is no controlling point at all.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for answering that question. We just got a question in from James. He asks, who writes the underlying code for a blockchain, and how do we verify its accuracy?
Yeah, so the initial code for blockchain was proposed in an anonymous paper by the anonymous founder of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, which to date, nobody is sure who that is. Most of the underlying original code is open source, and that was done because the view is the more people who can see it and work on it, the better it will be. From there are consortiums and also companies that have sprung up who have taken that code and they use it to develop their own applications. One is called Hyperledger, and built upon that, IBM has come in and they're building their own business application blockchain. In terms of verifying the code, that's really for the programmers, but the idea is that because it's open source and you have so many people working on it that that essentially the code is sound. But there's a little bit of faith still involved with that.
And I echo all those points. I would just add, I think at this point, this industry is a little bit in its infancy, and there's, I would venture to say, a shortage of people who have expertise in blockchain programming and development. But as you see more pilot projects having successes, I suspect you'll attract more programmers into this area.
Yeah, and I would point out, not that I like to use Bitcoin as the poster child for blockchain, but the Bitcoin network, which now houses a tremendous amount of value, has never actually been hacked.
All right, so thank you so much for your answer. So we're going to get one last question, and then please keep sending in your questions as we go along. I see a lot of your questions coming in. They all sound great. And so without further ado, the last question is again from Tariq, and it's about contracts. So can one not trigger false external conditions to execute the contract?
Yeah, that's absolutely a concern. As you introduce these oracles, you're introducing the ability to put information into the network that is potentially not accurate and kind of fool the network. So those are all concerns that you would have to think about in designing these and implementing governance and protocols, especially within a business atmosphere. But I think, Tariq, you've hit the nail on the head with that.
Yeah, just one thing to echo that. I mean, one thing that we're seeing when people are asking about blockchain is, you know, to the extent information is put into a blockchain network for the first time, you sort of have this garbage in, garbage out problem. You know, if the information that you're using to start this blockchain ledger is somehow incorrect, you know, you're going to have an issue. But that is definitely something that needs to be worked out.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much. Well, I'll hand it back to Molly for the applications.
Thanks. So those are great questions. Thank you, and hopefully you'll have some more at the end for us as well. Can we go to the next slide, please? So what are some of the applications we're seeing in the energy industry, and what applications might be on the horizon? I'll walk through several examples. They're listed here on the slide. And as I walk through each of these, I'll try to highlight some of the unique policy and legal issues that are likely to come up. And they cross over into a variety of areas of law, including consumer protection, antitrust and competition law, commodities regulation, and cybersecurity. Next slide, please. So blockchain applications involving distributed energy resources, or DERs, microgrids, and peer-to-peer energy trading are being made possible by the significant expansion and deployment of smart technology, such as smart meters and smart inverters. These smart technologies can be used in conjunction with a blockchain to record any stream of data from the meter, such as the amount of energy being produced and the amount of energy being consumed. Blockchain's ability to record, verify, store, and grant permissioned access to certain information makes it well suited to potentially address some of the grid monitoring and information access issues we see today, as utilities and wholesale market operators struggle to understand where DERs are on the grid and how information about them can be communicated among the DER facility, the distribution operator, and the transmission operator. This information flow enabled by blockchain can also be paired with smart contracts loaded into the blockchain in order to create a distributed grid that enables interaction between end users and is able to potentially manage itself without a central control operator. So while that application of blockchain is aimed more at wholesale market integration, there's also potential transformative applications for peer-to-peer trading at the retail level. So the Brooklyn microgrid, funded by LO3 Energy, has gotten a lot of headlines. It's a pilot project aimed at testing how blockchain can be used to facilitate neighbor-to-neighbor sales of green energy. So in the picture, you can see it's a street that has some neighbors with solar panels on their roofs and some without. And the concept is that using smart meters, they will record, neighbors will record the energy generated by their solar panels, store that information in the blockchain, and then all energy not used by the neighbor with the solar panels can be sold to other neighbors, and all transactions can be recorded and settled through the blockchain network. Currently, the neighbors are exchanging RECs, or renewable energy credits, representative of the underlying energy, but not buying and selling power. However, the blockchain has built-in smart contract functionality, meaning that in the future, the neighbors could set up smart contracts with predefined triggers, which would dictate when, how, and at what price they buy and sell power to each other. Billing and settlement would be handled within the blockchain, enabling the transfer of electrons to be accounted for and paid between community members and reducing transaction costs. So this is often referred to as making microtransactions, or really small sales of electricity, more cost-effective. So what are some of the legal implications in the U.S. for this type of peer-to-peer activity? So first, this peer-to-peer activity may be characterized as a retail sale of electricity that's often regulated by the state. Because of regulatory hurdles, we understand that at this point, the Brooklyn microgrid is only contemplating trading and sale of RECs, or renewable energy credits, that are representative of the energy, the green energy. To move to actual peer-to-peer sales of electricity, there are open questions about the role state public utility commissions will play and what regulation might be needed to protect consumers if end-use customers are dictating price and other conditions upon which they will sell power to their neighbors. Blockchain's ability to help integrate DERs and microgrids will also likely spur more debate around the utility business model and continue to raise many of the same issues that have come up in the net metering and direct access debates around what the role of the utility should be and whether and how the local utility should be compensated. Next slide, please. So blockchain technology is also viewed as a way to reduce transaction costs for EV charging and managing charging to support the grid. I'm sure many, if not all of you, are familiar with CAISO's duck curve, where there's a deep midday drop in net load driven by lots of solar flooding onto the grid, then a steep ramp up in the late afternoon as the sun goes down and people come home from work and start using more electricity. EVs have been touted as a way to smooth the duck curve, but only if their charging can be controlled and coordinated. A blockchain network layered with smart contracts could ensure charging during optimal times to support the overall grid, and there are companies starting to look at these applications, especially in Europe. Blockchain is being used as a way to facilitate greater access to charging infrastructure as well. There's a company based in California that recently announced a partnership with a German energy company to bring a blockchain-based application to the United States that would enable people to share their charging stations with other EV drivers. That blockchain application also includes a payment system and allows the charging station owners to set rates for each charging session. The same concept of using blockchain and smart contracts to record production and consumption and handle billing and settlement for EVs is also being applied by a German utility in a pilot program for EV charging. And that pilot program uses blockchain technology to charge customers only for the amount of electricity used during the charging session, not the time at the charging station. Next slide, please. So in my opinion, wholesale energy trading may be one of the first areas where blockchain will likely take hold and scale in the energy industry because of the ability to translate some of the use cases already happening in the financial sector. So for energy and energy derivatives markets, there are two areas where blockchain and smart technology and smart contracts have the potential to profoundly change these markets and that industry participants are focused on. One is in improving back office function, and the second is in the creation of self-executing smart derivatives. With respect to blockchain, or with respect to back office functions, I think there's really two areas where we're seeing discussion and pilot projects starting, and the first is in counterparty onboarding and know your customer compliance. For this, energy market participants can really draw on the experience and work done by financial services firms, which are really out ahead on these issues in many respects. And these applications are built on blockchain's ability to assign unique identifiers and manage digital identity really well. A second area is in reduced settlement times. Today, while many energy and energy derivatives transactions are agreed to electronically, companies still maintain separate systems of records, and through the settlements and billing process, those records must be reconciled. If transactions are recorded on a blockchain and all parties have access to the same verified transaction record, the kind of golden record that Ben mentioned, and that record is available through a distributed database, that can significantly reduce costs associated with settlement and billing. And this could be especially significant in the organized markets in the U.S. administered by various RTOs and ISOs, where billing and settlement processes can take months. So not only can this idea of a golden record reduce settlement time, but it's also relevant for regulatory reporting requirements and the potential for there to be a regulatory node along the lines of the sort of DOE LNG example that Ben gave. And this is where the idea that a regulator could be able to view in real time transactions occurring in the marketplace. And I know the CFTC chairman has actually been interested in this idea. Next slide, please. Oh, actually, you can stay on that side. So smart contracts that can automatically execute based on predefined actions are also a good fit for smart derivatives. In the context of energy markets, you can think of a derivative contract or margin call that automatically executes once certain conditions are met, like the option agreement we covered earlier. This could change how businesses think about credit risk and the process of collateral management and settlement, and also result in improved liquidity and efficiency in the markets. So of course there are a lot of regulatory issues and market rule changes to be sorted out to capture these benefits. There's also a lot of other legal questions that are likely to arise, including whether the cryptography and the architecture of the blockchain network is sufficient to protect proprietary information, not just because individual companies' business interests in protecting the information, but also to ensure competitively sensitive information cannot be accessed by competitors, which might raise antitrust issues. In creating these trading networks, there's also IP ownership and licensing issues if parties are jointly developing and owning blockchain-based trading applications. So obviously this is a lot of issues to sort out in getting these up and running. So next slide, please. And I'll cover this one quickly because Ben hit on the DOE example earlier, and really this gets to how blockchain can be used to manage supply chains and reduce costs. There was recently an announcement of IBM partnering with an oil trading firm and a financial services firm to deliver an crude oil finance trading platform, and that platform would allow crude oil traders and their banks to share and record transaction data, including trade documents, shipping updates, delivery and payment confirmations, all on a single decentralized ledger. And that would be a permission ledger with only pre-approved parties being able to access and record to the network. And the goal would be to be replacing the existing paper-heavy manual processes that are much more costly, and this would also improve transparency and data sharing, and eventually removing each party's need to maintain and update its own respective records. Next slide, please. So the next example is an application related to physical infrastructure and smart sensors. And hopefully by this point you're seeing a common theme to these. It's the idea of a kind of interconnected network with no central party, this mesh network that we talked about earlier. So now picture each electrical tower that is in this picture here is equipped with a smart device that not only monitors the conditions of the transmission facilities, but also other factors like ambient conditions of temperature, humidity, light, and sound. Each tower smart device has could have a unique identifier, and all the streams of data recorded by the smart sensors could be stored in a blockchain. So now picture a storm that takes out a transmission tower like the one on the bottom. Through the blockchain, the poles are able to share the vital information with one another and potentially respond in real time without a centralized monitoring system or a centralized dispatcher. So not only could this improve reliability and resiliency of the system, but the streams of data on ambient conditions that are being recorded by these sensors and stored in the blockchain, it could make that information easier to be sold and licensed to another user, like a government or environmental agency or financial party, again, all through a blockchain application. So this concept is currently being tested on poles in the Australian outback, where utility response to pole issues can sometimes be slow. That utility is also contracting for monitoring services and selling data recorded in the blockchain network. So not only does this create new business opportunities for utilities with smart infrastructure, but it also raises a lot of important questions about cybersecurity as access to critical infrastructure increase. On that note, I would point you all to a really interesting article from two NATO staffers that recently came out. The staffers were from the energy security section, arguing that blockchain's decentralized and distributed nature and its consensus protocols are really a solution for defending the power grid against the types of malware and code injection attacks that we've seen to date. Next slide, please. And then our final example of a blockchain application deals with tracking renewable attributes like renewable energy credits and renewable identification numbers. So Ben, Rex, and RINs, and this is along the lines of Ben's example of an SREC earlier. So I'll just highlight a few ways that a blockchain can offer improvements over current systems. And the first is that once the production of the renewable energy or fuel is verified, potentially through just the smart meter itself recording the production or a third party indicating that it has been produced and it is green energy, once that is verified and added to a blockchain, the REC or RIN will have a unique identifier, and the distributed ledger can prevent the REC or RIN from being traded twice and therefore eliminate questions about double spending. And much like the energy trading examples, you could also establish regulator nodes, making it easier for regulators to evaluate whether renewable obligations and goals are being met. This automated recording, tracking, and trading system could also help organizations and states better monitor progress towards achieving particular climate goals. So for example, IBM announced a partnership with a Chinese company to implement a blockchain-based green asset management program that would help monitor and control carbon emissions to meet China's particular climate goals related to the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So many of the concepts and applications we've just talked about today are really proof of concepts or pilot programs and are in the very early stages of development. But we see that their potential could really restructure and revolutionize the energy industry. Blockchain is often compared to the early days of the internet, and when the first emails were sent in the 1970s, it would have been very difficult to anticipate that that technology was laying the groundwork for the types of applications we have today, like Uber and Airbnb. So because this can all seem very theoretical and conceptual, to close, we wanted to give you a framework for thinking about how blockchain applications could develop and evolve. A recent Harvard Business Review article actually set out this framework, which I think is helpful to think about how these applications might develop. So it starts with applications that involve a low degree of coordination or complexity and are not particularly novel. These are single-use applications like the first emails researchers sent using ARPANET. And for blockchain, this could involve replacing legacy billing and settlement systems with blockchain-based applications. The next step involves applications that have a higher degree of novelty but still require a low degree of coordination or complexity. For the internet, this included companies that developed intranets to manage and share information internally. And for the blockchain, the next progression could be smart energy infrastructure examples that we talked about, tying in sensors on utility infrastructure to improve operations and also potentially open new business opportunities. The third step involves substitutions that replace older ways of doing business. These substitution examples are not particularly novel, but they require a higher degree of coordination and involve broader and increasingly public uses. So for the internet, the example of a substitution phase is online businesses like Amazon overtaking brick and mortar stores. Smart derivatives could be part of the third phase of blockchain adoption in the energy industry, building upon the established blockchain networks to layer in smart contracts that would replace current energy derivative contracting. And then the fourth and final step are the truly transformative applications that are both novel and complex. They require coordination of many new actors and market participants. They would require institutional agreement on standards and processes and require potentially major social, legal, and political change. Our internet examples for those are Napster and Uber, which really disrupted music and then now the taxi industry. For blockchain, the most transformative applications we've discussed are likely the creation of the peer-to-peer transactive networks that allow end users to trade and manage electricity use. So while it took about 30 to 40 years to go from the ARPANET emails to Napster and Uber, it's up for debate how long it might take this transformation from blockchain to take hold in the energy industry. but there are certainly a lot of interesting questions to sort out along the way.